Hello everyone. In today's video, I wanted to build a more modern TypeScript API using NestJS and Prisma to connect to a Postgres SQL database. So this is sort of a continuation on top of my previous API videos, which used classic, Express and Node.js. But I want to take a more modern take with this using TypeScript with NestJS. Let's dig into it. First of all, NestJS, it's a framework which is built on top of Node.js and uses mostly Express or, if you want, Fastify. So it adds on a layer which makes building APIs or backend services a lot more efficient and scalable, much easier for you as a developer. And now I use NestJS for all my projects, which is why I'm doing this video, as I'm continuing to learn about the usability and usefulness of NestJS. It's quite similar to if you were to use something like Spring for Java, for example. It has controllers, services, and modules, which is really nice way to abstract away a lot of logic for you as a developer. So to get started, first of all, let's just install the NestJS CLI for ourselves so that we can actually utilize that as a tool. I already got it installed, so once you've installed it, you can just run nest new and create a new project. Let's call this money API, as I want to create an API for managing my money. I'm going to use PNPM. Usually this is quite fast. There we go. So actually now the money API is directly in my home directory, so I'm going to move this to money API slash code money API. Okay. So it should be in here. Yep, there it is. Cool. And we're going to open it up using cursor. So right away, you've got a controller, a module, and a service, as well as a specification file, which is the test file for your controller. Since we're going to be rewriting some stuff, I'm going to just remove this test because we're going to look at tests in a future video. This is much more of an overview of how you can build an API pretty fast using NestJS. So if you look at the main TS file, this is actually where we're creating the API using Nest Factory. Nest Factory is just a helper that creates a server for you. So it returns an app, which is essentially a wrapped Express app by default, unless you use Fastify. And then it just runs by listening to the port 3000. Now it's using a module here called app module. And modules is essentially a way for you to collect controllers and services and other things into, well, they're calling it a module. So this is a way to abstract away imports and inclusions of different parts of or different pieces of your logic into much more overviewable and maintainable parts of your app. So this is a way of structuring your logic essentially and your routes. So it's much more easily maintainable, understandable for you as a developer and as a team. So this module has a controller called app controller, and it's also got an app service. If we look at the controller, first of all, if you're not familiar with the MVC kind of framework or how do you call it? Like a process. It's a way of building apps called MVC, which is module, view, and controller. The controller is responsible for directing requests, essentially. So the controller takes in a request, post, get, put, whatever you want, and then it directs that request to the service to handle that logic and perform the actions that the actual request should. And then the controller returns a response based on what happened. So that's the purpose of the controller, while the service then does whatever the controller wants it to do. So for example, if you're creating something in the database, the controller would take the post request or the put request and then tell the service to create something for it. The service would then return a response to the controller with some kind of response value, like it went well or something went wrong. And then the controller is responsible of returning a request response to the consumer of the API, essentially. So now that we have this set up, we can actually just run it so you can see what happens. So if you run pnpm start here, the actual API is going to run. You're going to see you get some logs here that tells you exactly what's going on. And we can use Postman as our little API testing tool here. So this API is running on port 3000. So it's going to be http://localhost colon 3000. And we just send a GET request. That's going to return a string of hello world. Now what's happening here, of course, is that the actual main listening to port 3000 has an app module. The app module currently doesn't have any routes in here, but the controller that is running the app does have a route. Since we are not precising exactly which route it is listening to the root. So it's picking up every single request currently being sent to the app or the root, essentially. So if I were to type in hello here, it's not going to say anything because it's just listening to the root. So that's kind of the basics of how that works. So if we were to add, for example, hello here into our controller, this would wrap all the requests in our controller with a /hello in the URL. If we add that, restart the app API, and then run the request on hello, we would get hello world. This also means that if we go back and request the root, we wouldn't get anything. We would get a 404. Cool. So now that you basically understand what happened there, you can see that we have a GET request here. This is a annotation on top here called GET. This tells NestJS that getHello, the method, is actually the callback function or the method that handles the GET request for the control hello. So every GET request on the root of hello, essentially /hello, gets patched into this function getHello. And then this one returns something to the consumer of the API. In this case, it runs a function getHello on the app service. The app service, right here, exposes getHello as a function which returns a string. And that string is hello world. Right, so getHello function is a get request respond function that calls app service getHello, which then returns the string hello world. Hope that makes sense. Otherwise, I'll refer to the documentation of NestJS. So now that we got some overview of how NestJS works, we're going to be adding Prisma. Prisma is a really useful tool for connecting to databases and managing your models. It's essentially an ORM, so I can't remember what it stands for, but essentially it's a way for you to managing different versions of your database structure, your models, by creating different migrations for it, so you can manage different versions over time and upgrading your database in a more controlled way. Prisma is super simple as well because it's integrated well with TypeScript and JavaScript, so you get the types very neatly into your project, which is why I love using it. And it's very easy to manage your models as well. You're going to get to that in a second. So of course, Prisma goes very nicely together with NestJS. So to get started, first of all, you need to install some dependencies. Now, all of these, except for Prisma, does already come with NestJS, so you just need to install Prisma. So let's do that. Let's just close down the API and install Prisma. And I think that's a dev dependency. So we're just going to do pm install -d capital D Prisma. Cool. So once we've done that, we're going to have the basics in place, but we also need to set up the actual Prisma file. Now you can easily do this using the npx command prisma init. This will create a folder as well as a schema file here. Now this schema file is exactly where you write all your models. You're outlining the whole database structure for Prisma so that it can manage all of the models for you and version everything very nicely. On top of this, it also creates an env file, and in here you can add a database URL environment variable, which tells Prisma how to connect to your Postgres database. Cool, so now that we got that, we're going to jump into our schema.prisma, and we're going to create a model. Now this model is going to be the first table that we created. So the expense as a model is going to be what takes in a number, which represents the actual expense for us, and stores it in our table. So we can see the cursor is already auto-completing stuff for us, which is nice. So we are going to be having amount, int, description, created at, and updated at. That's pretty much it. We're just going to do it very simple. And we're going to add a database URL for ourselves as well. So I've got a Postgres SQL database running locally up here. And I have no password for that, and my database is called money. That's it. I don't have a password, so you don't have to give that. Cool. That should be it for the actual setup of Prisma, but we need to incorporate it into NestJS as well, which is what you do with Prisma service. So that is same as a app service. We're going to create a specific service for Prisma so that we can actually inject it into all of the modules that we want to be able to use the database connection for or with. So let's create a Prisma service.ts. And then you can essentially just copy over everything in here. I'm pretty sure that we're going to get everything automatically for or from cursor. I think this looks correct. Yeah. And we can see that we cannot find the Prisma client currently. That's because we haven't generated our Prisma client yet. So now that we've done that, we can actually just first of all run Prisma migrate dev. npm Prisma migrate dev. That's going to be, oh, okay. I don't have access to my database. Let's see if it's because we have the public end there. No. Postgres SQL. Oh, sorry, that's the wrong username. There we go. So now we are actually connected to it. Reset public schema. Yes. And now that we have, we're creating the first migration, we need to add a name to it. So let's call this first table expenses. First expenses. Iteration. That's a much more fitting name. Now, while we're running the migration, it's also going to run the generate command, which you can run by yourself later on using Prisma generate. Now that's going to generate the Prisma client for you. What that does is that essentially copies down the structure of the whole schema for you down into the TypeScript format, so you can use those files or the types in your TypeScript code. So now you can see that this resolves our import for us, which is really nice. Cool, so now that we've got that injection or the injectable, we can just add that to our provider's Prisma service here, and we can import the Prisma service. So this means that we can now use this in our controller, but most importantly in our app service file. So in our app service now, we can go in, we can import Prisma service, and in our constructor, we're going to add the Prisma service. What's happening here is the module is injecting the Prisma service into our service in our constructor, so we can access that inside of our method, which is really cool. So what we want to do now is that we actually want to add a expense to our database. So in our controller here, we are currently listening to the hello route. Let's call this expenses. And instead of using a get request, let's call that a post request. So let's import the post as well. We call this add expense. And that's going to take in a body request or a body, well, yeah, a body, a JSON body of amounts and description. Because if you recall, if you're looking here at our model, we're going to need an amount and a description. Nice. So now that we got that, we can go over to our service. Or our, yeah, exactly, our app service. In here, we want to create a new function called create expense. And that's going to take in an amount and a description, just like the controller does. Now using these, we're going to create the expense with the data that we are provided with. Currently, it's returning a string. That's old code, which is not what we want. So we're simply going to do a return here. Now, since this .prisma.expense is an asynchronous function, we're going to have to add an async to our function here in the beginning, and then return a promise string. Let's see what it complains about. And since we're not going to be returning a string, of course, we need to return expense. Now, expense can be imported from the Prisma client. So this is what I talked about before when we are running the generate command. It generates these types in the Prisma client so that we can use them in our TypeScript code, which is really neat. So what the create expense does essentially is just creates an expense in our database with the data that we provide, an amount and a description, and then it returns the created object for us so we can return it out into the API, which is really neat. So all we got to do now, really, is just run, well, yeah, this. And since this is not an asynchronous function, we just add an async before. And here we can see that we want to return an expense as well, instead, actually as a promise. You can see that cursor really nicely helps us with this. But we can also shorthand this very, very neatly by just doing return this app service create expense, body and description. Oh, sorry, amount description. Nice. I think that's pretty much it for creating our expense. So if you run start now, should not be any issues. And if we go and do a post to expenses, we go into our body tab here, we create raw, click raw, use JSON, and we add an amount of $100 and description of new headphones. We should get, yep, an ID, an amount of 100, some description, and a created ad and updated ads. Which means it worked. Nice. Now we can do as well, let me just jump into our Money API folder. So we can run Prisma Studio. Prisma Studio is essentially just a tool for you to overview your database. So you can look at the entries that you have in your database and the models. So as you can see here, we have just one model called expense. And inside of our expense, we only have one expense with an ID, amount, description, created at, and updated at field. This is a very nice way for you to look over the data that you have when you're debugging or when you're just looking over the data. And you can also just delete records if you want, which is really nice. Sweet. Then the final thing you want to do before we finish off the video is I want to just list out all the expenses that we have, which is really simple. So let's use a get this time, which means we need to import it as well. So let's add that to our import entry. Now we're going to call this get expenses. And of course, it's going to return expense as an array or a list. And the app service, we're going to expose the same thing called get expense. So we're going to call that async get expenses. And that essentially just runs the find many in our Prisma query. We're going to add order by as well, which is going to order by the created at field. So whenever we create a new expense, we're going to order that along the list based on which one was created the last. And that's it. Restart, go over, let's add a new request, forget all expenses, and there you go. That's one of the expenses. We have just one, obviously. So let's add another one for, I don't know, $10. Let's say we bought some lunch. Nice. And we go over, and you can see the last request we had, or the last expense we added was our lunch. Cool. That's it, actually. This has been a very quick tutorial overview of how to use NestJS. I'm going to go more into how to use NestJS in more complicated setups, as well as adding off to the API and testing setup and so on and so forth. But this was just a brief look into how to set up a NestJS API. I hope you enjoyed. If you have any thoughts, any requests or anything like that, just leave them in the comments below, and I will see you guys in the next video.